Hands on, feet on, powered on. On your mark. On is the start of everything. On is the key to learning. Being on an environment, not just in it. Being on the world, not just of it.
Tarquette understands how important on is.
We work on it every day. On the ground with you, designing flooring experiences to grow on, dream on, and get on with it.
Hello, thank you for having us. I am Sunny Smith. I originally hail from Utah, but I have been a Louisianian now for half of my life. I've worked with CSRS for over 4 years, working in disaster recovery. Our firm is an architectural engineering and program management firm located in Louisiana. As you can imagine, Louisiana keeps us very busy as far as disaster recovery operations, and we hold the dubious honor of having the most federally declared disasters in the country. This is Chad Lynch. He is the operations director for Ascension Parish School Board. Chad's been with the school board since 2002 and is responsible for planning, maintenance, construction, and risk management for the school board. Since Chad's team is responsible for construction at the school board, he led the rebuilding efforts for APSB from the 2016 floods.
You want me to add to that a little bit? So I've been around through many disaster type things. I'm a retired guardsman, so I had 21 years in the Army National Guard, which gave me a lot of disaster experience. But then my time here at the school board, unfortunately, I have been involved with floods and the COVID thing and fires. You know, we've had our list of emergencies to plan for, so I really hope to share some of those experiences with y'all.
So today we'll be focusing on continuity of operations in post-disaster environments for public schools, which starts long before a disaster. Successful continuity of operations in a post-disaster environment relies heavily on actions taken long before the impact of a disaster in your community. Thorough and well thought out planning and exercises performed now will help ensure education and school operations can resume with less downtime. While there's no federal law that requires schools and school districts to have an emergency plan, those that do fare much better in disaster recovery and response. There are options available for some initial funding for planning exercises for emergency management. And I would suggest that you explore the Department of Education and the Department of Homeland Security for some of those planning funds. Today our agenda covers planning for recovery, physical options available for schools in the recovery process, and strengthening your formal and informal partnerships. So with temp facilities, you always want to take into account that you're identifying the least vulnerable areas. You know, whether it's an existing school campus that's not in a flood zone, or one that has never taken on water, or, you know, in a hurricane situation, you know, one that's been built to withstand hurricane winds. You know, any of those things should be taken into account. And remember that when you're identifying space for temp facilities, you can think outside the box. It doesn't have to be a typical space. You know, are there large parking lots somewhere that you could lease space? You know, I know in New Orleans, in St. John the Baptist parishes, they got really creative with some of the spaces that they put their modular classroom temp facilities on. You know, there was campuses that had been shuttered that were reopened. There were, you know, commercial parking lots that were used. So just keep in mind, it doesn't have to be a typical space, but have an idea of where you're going to go. You know, where will we put these extra classrooms?
I want to add to that, Sonny. One of the factors when you're deciding, you know, where these temporary buildings might go, in your community, the people that live around the school, they hope to return to that site as soon as possible. So in your plan, if your plan has you platooning 10 miles away for a long period of time, you're going to get some political pressure on that to come back to the community where the people live in, where the students live. And we had that factored in. So our goal was to get back, to get school going again on that site as soon as possible, because it also affected busing. Any of the decisions we made to have students go to school outside of their district at some other school, that had to be more of a temporary thing, not a permanent long-term solution through the whole flood recovery process, but only as long as you have to, because you want to get bus routes back to normal. And thinking about your bus routes when you're thinking about where are you going to provide tent facilities for this school, is it on-site or off-site? It might be phased, where off-site and 10 miles away is for a short period of time, and then so that you can get busing back to normal. And like car rider, the parents who bring their kids to school don't want to drive to that other school for a long period of time. So if in your plan you have something that covers you for a short period of time, but then we want to get back to this site as soon as we possibly can. And in our case, we got back to the site before our buildings were completely done. We did platooning for a little while, where our buses brought kids over to that school, and then we opened the tent buildings, and we were able to be back on site in that community, which made those people happy, even though they weren't in their permanent facility yet. So think about those kinds of things, busing and car rider and the parents' routine of getting the kids to school.
So we also have remote learning. As we've seen with the COVID-19 measures as of late, school districts should be prepared to implement remote learning for the students whenever possible. Although it's pretty new to everybody. I think overall, the school systems have really figured out what the needs are as far as being able to put kids online, and have remote learning for at least short periods of time until things can get relatively normal again, whether that's for COVID-19 or a flooding event or whatever. That's always an option, especially now that we know that to at least some extent it works. So keep that in mind as an option when you're planning these scenarios.
That's been essential for us during COVID, the ability to remote learn. It's helped us during just bad weather days. When remote learning wasn't a thing, when we didn't have one-to-one and we had to cancel school because of potential bad weather. Well, then the kids are left home sometimes on a beautiful day because the bad weather didn't happen. But what we were able to do recently was is call for a stay-home day with remote learning, as long as the internet was available. And the weather didn't come, and rather than trying to go pick up the kids late and change your plan, you just leave them at home and do the remote learning. So it's a very great solution to many of the problems we've been having.
In this next section, we'll talk about accessibility of systems. We're not going to go into great detail, but accessibility to accounting systems and procurement systems is essential in an emergency environment. You have to get supplies. You have to get money moving. Anything that we do in the recovery process takes money. So we have to have redundancy in accounting systems, and we need to have backup plans for procurement if the systems are down. In the event of a federally declared disaster, you'll want to plan for a separate account for disaster expenses. APSB created a separate flood account that was utilized for flood-related costs, and were tracked by type of expense and flood location in the accounting system. If FEMA is involved, this is a requirement. I would suggest that you put the process to set up a new account or fund in writing as part of the planning process, so that it's clear to all parties how the accounting and coding will be processed for disaster-related costs. This is one thing I think that is overlooked a lot. We get into so much of the physical aspects. How do we get kids physically back in school? How do we get them there? Those types of things. But the accounting is a big deal when you have federal money involved. And like I said, it is a requirement if you're using FEMA to have a separate account. So if you just have that process in place, you don't even need to name the account, but this is how we will set it up immediately upon an emergency or a disaster. With technology today, most public entities have a backup accounting system. So, redundancy needs to happen, but I think in most cases that is happening now with the internet. Backup servers are in place, that kind of thing. I just wanted to mention that because these primary systems can go down in an emergency. Just like sometimes, you have a hard time getting cash out of an ATM after a hurricane or a flood. It's going to be the same thing with your systems, so just wanted to mention redundancy there.
Sonny, you're making me remember having flashbacks of the flood. We had begun the process before the 2016 flood of scanning our documents. And so you're talking financial redundancy in servers, IT redundancy, but any documents you have that are paper copy only in the file and not scanned, I suggest you start scanning them. Scan the things you can and get that behind you where you don't have historical documents that are only paper that could be damaged by a storm or a flood. And so for us, we had done that, and so we had that redundancy. We had many things got flooded in wet documents, and we did collect them and restore them, but for the most part, we had them digitally already. And so that backup there is also important. Can be important to you. Can cause you to lose records, like examples. Free and reduced lunch records. Who are the families that are on that? You don't want that to only be paper and then lose it and not have access to something that's that important.
Absolutely. And lastly, all public entities should have a documented procurement system in place that should account for normal procurement, but also emergency procurement, especially when state and federal funds are involved. In cases of FEMA or other federal involvement, public entities must follow the strictest of procurement laws, which is typically the federal guidelines. Procurement staff for any public entity should always be well-versed in public bid law and federal procurement requirements.
CFR 2?
Yeah, 2 CFR.
2 CFR.
Yeah. So in this section, we'll talk about recovery simulations, which for me is the most important part of this. Once you've got your plan on paper, actually go through it and simulate a real event. So, in Chad's situation, he would simulate a flood event and say, X number of schools went down, these locations, what are we going to do? Who's going to do what? So that nobody has to stop and direct now what's going to happen. Everyone knows their roles, their responsibilities, and they act. So because federal funding is so tied to procurement and proper document controls, these folks need to be involved in your recovery simulation. Your document control staff, accounting staff, procurement personnel, the planning and construction department, your risk manager, anybody that could possibly have a hand in the recovery process should be involved in these simulations, even if they're not given a specific task at that time. If they're part of the process, they should be aware of what everyone else is doing, even if they don't have a current role in it. So I would suggest that you invite as many people to these simulations as possible, but I do think that it's very critical in actually going through a scenario because it makes it more real. People understand a little better how things are supposed to flow. And like I said, everyone knows what their responsibility is in it. And I would suggest that you don't just have simulations for disaster response, but also how recovery will be managed. So your immediate need, of course, you simulate and go through that scenario. What are we going to do with the kids for temp facilities? All that kind of stuff. But how are we going to manage the long-term recovery process? So there's 2 different scenarios there that you would want to go through. And again, always think about your typical peril for a disaster and phases throughout the recovery stages. recognize that your recovery operations will take staff away from their daily duties for a long time. You know, after an event, a disaster event, it's very stressful. Oftentimes, especially with the public school system, your staff, your faculty are local. They've gone through the event personally. And if they didn't personally get affected, somebody that is very close to them did. So, you know, you may need a dedicated recovery staff, an emergency team, if you will. It'll pay large dividends to have all of these roles and responsibilities lined out through an actual scenario and let people understand how everything is supposed to go. Regarding capacity building for your staff, I would direct them to a couple of websites. FEMA.gov has training online that you can take at your leisure for independent study courses for emergency operations. I would suggest your staff taking those kind of courses. GoStep, I know in Louisiana, has some training courses that are also available through louisianapa.com. So I would suggest, you know, to your staff that they take those courses.
So I can't, I'm listening to Sonny, and what I'm remembering is that in Louisiana, unfortunately, we don't really have to plan a hurricane drill or we get the drill because the hurricane threats come repeatedly. And so we're actually living it, and that causes us to practice it even though we may not get the weather. So we become well versed at certain disaster threats. And in your community, you may also have certain threats that happen regularly that you get the planning because it happens and you're forced to do the planning. But then there are other things that other types of events that may happen that maybe not as frequent and maybe not as feasible that they would happen, but you should plan for them. I mean, and like you said, Sonny, you don't want to plan in a vacuum. All of your staff needs to be involved. And I understand that school systems range in size. We're a growing school system. When I started, our staff was so small we didn't have a construction staff so much. We now have a safety and security manager and a risk manager. So we've added these people that help us to oversee these types of planning and drills. We do drills for active shooter, and we plan for these hurricanes and weather emergencies, but we don't do them by ourselves as a school system. We use our in-house staff, and as you said, all departments that might be involved or might not be involved are in the loop so they know what's going on. But we reach outside of the school system, and that's kind of a requirement. That's something that comes up in our planning with GoSep, where they tell you to use your state and federal officials. Obviously, you want to plan with them if you're talking national disaster or federal type thing. But then also the local officials, your fire, EMS, police, hospitals, counselors, all the types of people that might have to respond immediately with you. We do regular calls with them to talk about these types of disasters and to have a plan, because failing to plan is planning to fail. So, don't do it in a vacuum. Do it together with the other people, other agencies.
So in the next section, we'll talk about physical options available, which includes the temp facility options and funding options for response and recovery. Temporary facilities buy time for more strategic and resilient recovery planning and provides a temporary solution to house school campuses. Temporary facilities can come in a variety of forms, as we mentioned.
Chad, again, used several types of temporary facilities. First platooning,
Rentals,
temporary buildings. Within a few months, they put out a bid for modular temp classrooms. And through this process, over about a 5-month period, they went from all of these into a little more permanent temporary facility modular classrooms. And they housed roughly 5,200 students over the course of 2.5 years through their reconstruction process after the floods.
Sonny, it's important to note that it wasn't just classroom space that was needed. We had some rentals of like a tent for the band, because the band needed something bigger than a classroom, or a file storage room with air conditioning to keep paper files and copies. just storage containers. There were a few different types of things that we had to source, and those kinds of things could be pre-planned and pre-arranged.
Often temporary facilities like modular classrooms can be installed fairly quickly depending on the magnitude of your situation. Like I said, Ascension Parish School Board had 5,200 students that were out of school, that needed a home again. So the magnitude of what they were dealing with, they had to have some design done, some site work finished. So it did take about 5.5 months from bid time to school starting again in these modular classrooms, but that was mainly due to the magnitude in what they were dealing with. So there are options that can be quicker depending on your need, but there are also downsides that we should talk about. Modular classrooms have high wear and tear, especially for schools. They just don't hold up to the beating long term. So there are, some wear and tear and maintenance costs that may come with demobilizing them at the end of the process.
Well, I'll say this though, they were effective. Like back to where the timeline you were given for us for our disaster, within about 2 weeks we were back in school using the platooning methods and the rent other facilities methods, and having kids go to school elsewhere besides the flooded facility. We got back in a couple weeks, which was hard but doable. And then awaiting the finish of the completion of the temporary buildings took to the 5-month point. But the benefit is once you got the temporary buildings set up, you could again function like you did pre-storm. Once the buses and the parents drop the kids off at school, the education happens in the classroom. If you give them an air-conditioned classroom space, be it in a temporary building or a permanent building, it works. And the thing to note for parents was we got a lot of comments from parents about, what are these T buildings going to be like? Well, they're built to the same codes as the hard buildings, same building codes. So there wasn't really any difference. So once they're set up, you're back in business. So 5 months we're back in business. Still had to finish rebuilding our old schools, our flooded schools, but T buildings worked. It was a good solution.
And lastly, the only other downside, I think, to modular classrooms, that is, temporary classrooms, is they do take up space and infrastructure. But again, there are several options. Modular classrooms are not the only option. Leased facilities, owned facilities that may have been shuttered for future plans. I think about St. John the Baptist, after I think it was Isaac, they had a campus that had been shuttered a couple of years before that. They had long-term plans to rebuild a new school there, but we're in the process of kind of making that plan. When they got flooded, they moved an entire campus to that shuttered campus, did some quick repairs to make sure that everything was up to code, and got them in there pretty quickly. So just keep in mind, a temporary facility can come in many forms.
Sonny, one other form that I didn't mention was that we platooned. I mentioned platooning, which is splitting the use of a good facility that's undamaged amongst 2 student bodies, and you each get it half a day. That's what we call platooning. The other one that I don't know that we have a name for it, but we just doubled up. So some of our grade levels, and we did this by grade level. Our decision to double up or platoon was made by grade level by the educators. We had them talk about what was best for those grade levels. So our K-1-2 kids all went to a rental facility from 3 of the flooded K-1-2s. So we had all the kindergartners at the same school, and our student-teacher ratio that's usually 1 to 24, something like that, we couldn't do that anymore. We basically said, let's double up in the classrooms, and because we didn't have enough classrooms to do everything we wanted to do, doubling up the classrooms where you had 2 teachers and 2 groups of 24. So you had almost 40, about 40 kids in a classroom, but the 2 teachers were then able to team. So we had some situations where we just doubled up in a classroom to overcome the sudden reduction of facilities available to us, and it worked.
So let's talk funding. How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for the response? How are we going to pay for the recovery? Lack of financial resources is one of the greatest obstacles in resuming meaningful school operations in a post-disaster environment. While public assistance will eventually obligate grants to fund response and recovery, the lag time in receiving those funds will certainly hinder a school district's ability to move forward in a meaningful manner. Since most federal disaster grants are reimbursement programs, and there is typically a cost share for public entities, a plan of understanding of how you will fund the recovery process until the federal reimbursement is completed is critical. In addition to emergency funds earmarked for disaster response and recovery, school districts should seek other funding options available to them to jumpstart the recovery process outside of the typical FEMA recovery. So look at the U.S. Department of Education. Oftentimes after an event like the floods of 2016 or Hurricane Laura recently, restart funds will kick in. The Department of Education has funds available for immediate aid to restart school operations. So, as most of you are probably aware of that already, being part of the public school systems, just wanted to make sure that you're aware that those types of things are available. Allowable uses of the restart funds are broad and can often fill in the gap until FEMA public assistance and others come into play. So I think about APSB, after the 2016 floods, the restart money actually helped get them into their temp facilities. It was a small portion of the temp facility costs, but that money allowed design and the bid to move forward. So restart was critical in that, in getting them jump-started to recovery.
Sonny, from our perspective, with 6 or 7 facilities, pretty much decimated and wiped out immediately, I started thinking about what's the challenge here? What do we got to do here? And our superintendent, by the way, was new. We were in the process of a search when the flood happened, and we had just selected our superintendent. So the superintendent's first day of work was right after the flood. The flood happened before the superintendent started. So in my first discussions with the superintendent about this challenge, for me, what I told him is that the challenge wasn't the construction that we had to do. That's simple. We know how to do construction. We're a growing district with new schools going up every year. But the challenge was the funding. How do you create the cash flow? How do you sustain that cash flow until you start receiving the reimbursements through FEMA? And so the challenge was a financial challenge, more than a construction challenge. So how do you win that? And we had this discussion, and I probably had it with you as well. You win that by knowing the rules and following the rules to getting the funding back. If you know the rules and you follow the rules and you don't ever try to cheat the system, you only apply for and ask for what you lost, and you do so in accordance with the FEMA rules, then you have a better chance of quickly getting reimbursed. And so for us, we used a combination of our reserve funds to start paying for things, and also just cash flow, things that we had budgeted for this year, and we were hoping to spend it, but get it back before we needed to spend it on that thing we had budgeted it for. So by using those couple of methods, we were able to get the projects going, and by following the rules, I think we did speed up how quick we started receiving money from FEMA, and that helped, because as soon as money started coming back in for the things that we spent, we could sustain this for about what took 3.5 to 4 years total, And so having a reserve policy as a school board is probably required by law, but if not, you should have one, and you plan to use that. But that wasn't enough for us. We had, probably twice, more than twice, almost 3 times the value of the damages, so our reserve was only 1/3 of what we needed. And you have to find resourceful ways of coming up with the other cash, since, like you said, you have to front the money. It can be done.
All right, in this last section, we'll explore the formal and informal relationships and how these partnerships can have a huge impact on your recovery. At the state level, get to know leadership and working level liaisons from both agencies, and hopefully they will be coordinating with each other. So I'm talking FEMA, PA, CDBG. You know, the state has representatives that are our liaisons, and this isn't just in Louisiana. This is actually the way that it's supposed to be in all FEMA declared disaster work. So you'll always have a state counterpart that is there to advocate for you. Make friends with them as soon as you can. You know, if that person specifically hasn't been identified to you, talk to state leadership. You know, in Louisiana, like I say, it's GOSEP. In Texas, they have the TDEM. Florida has the FDEM. So, you know, they're all the same type of entity. They are the state liaison for federal disaster funds. You know, work with your state grantee for public assistance funding. If you have immediate needs, there are opportunities in some cases to get expedited funding for immediate need things. You know, whether that's sheltering, whether it's, you know, getting temp facilities on board. You know, there are expedited funds that can be explored through FEMA PA.
You know, ideas on how to build the relationships. You know, identify who your lead in public assistance, the HMGP programs, you know, the community development block grant programs. They all have websites, typically listed with state agencies, but try to figure out who they are and build a relationship with them. Ask them to meet with you before a disaster hits. You know, at the federal level, get to know your FEMA regional administrators and the head of the recovery division specifically. You know, invite them to simulations, you know, especially your state counterparts. That's part of what they do in the emergency management world when they're not working on an active disaster. So, you know, involve them in your recovery simulations and planning processes. Invite them to your next meeting, you know, the next time they're in your city. Another idea is to attend a couple of conferences where you've got stakeholders that frequently attend, like this one. You know, other good conferences related to disasters, you know, the National Hurricane Conference, we've got NEMA. There's several entities like A4LE that do wonderful conferences every year, and a lot of them provide information that can be helpful in the recovery process.
I'd say that's huge, Sonny. Our relationships that our educators have with associations and conferences that they attend, as well as my construction folks, the associations that we're part of become the relationships that help us after a storm. They're the people we reach out to that have similar problems, that might have similar assets and be able to share or loan something, but they have been who we've leaned on many times, and vice versa. You know, they become your peers, and they can help you with best practices, you know, at a minimum, if not other things. But.
Absolutely. And remember, you know, HUD, CDBG is a completely separate federal entity. You know, sometimes the federal programs will kind of mirror each other or link up to close the gap on funding. You know, HUD and FEMA PA are very different. They actually don't have the same state agencies that manage them typically. So just keep that in mind, that you may have to reach out to two different people to ask the same questions for two separate federal programs. So keep that in mind.
So the benefits of these relationships are knowing who to go to while both of you aren't managing a disaster. You know, building these relationships will often help expedite a resolution for your specific need at that time. You know, if I've developed a relationship with Chad over the last 6 months, and you know, I know that he's dealing with the same thing, and I can call him and say, hey, what did you do? Or, hey, who did you go to?
Sonny, our superintendent in this COVID thing regularly was on the phone with friends of his in the Superintendent's Association comparing notes. Everybody's affected by COVID. He used that group as a sounding board, a small group of the members of that association, And I think it was a tremendous help for us because we knew what they were doing to solve this problem or that problem. It gave us ideas and options to consider to see if they work for us. You know, very important, those relationships.
So some of the formal partnership agreements are MOAs, Memorandum of Understanding, CEA, Cooperative Endeavor Agreements. There's several different acronyms for the same type of thing. But you'll want to look at, do we have cooperative agreements in place with, sometimes public school entities will have a relationship with a charter school where, there are lease agreements in place for buildings, there are busing requirements that the public entity is responsible for, or vice versa. Know what those are. They don't always have to be for your typical operations. It could be in the time of an emergency. They provide a shelter.
Well, we have a pre-existing, one example for us is a pre-existing arrangement with our parish government who our OEP is part of, but they've identified which of our school facilities can be used as a shelter. And that benefits the community more so than our school system, but that's a pre-arranged agreement that we have with them. We know and anticipate that they might need those buildings for shelters at certain times. And in some ways that helps us too, not, the community as well as the school system.
So MOAs and CEAs and all of these other acronyms, they're a way to have direct relationships and partnerships with other entities. Like I said, you may have an agreement, whether, sometimes these can be informal too, keep that in mind. But if it involves any kind of funding aspect, it would need to be a formal agreement with specifics as to who's responsible for what, if you're going to request reimbursement from FEMA or CDBG HUD in the future. So, if you've got an informal agreement that ends up taking on, a financial aspect after a disaster, just put it in writing, get it written down, make sure that everybody understands, the agreement. It's always best to have it ahead of time. So, talking formally, public and private schools, like Chad said, they often have agreements for, in some type of way or another, but, we may have agreements in place for use of facilities after a storm or during repairs. What I would suggest in any of these agreements that it's always reciprocal. You've got an agreement with another school district, let's say to provide shelter. I would suggest that agreement also says that you come to their need as well. So it's a mutual reciprocal relationship. You would want to have roles, responsibilities, duration, all that kind of stuff, just like with a regular contract or, typical lease agreement, that kind of thing. Like I said, if FEMA's involved, you want it to clearly state who's responsible for what and what will happen when.
And that's where we ran into trouble with reimbursement sometimes, Sonny, is if our agreements didn't have a clear scope of work and a clear cost and weren't procured properly with federal clauses and all that, all those I's and T's have to be dotted so that when you chase the reimbursement and you apply for it, you've already met the criteria. And, early on you think, well, I'm in an emergency, I don't have to do that. There really reaches a point where you really need to solidify those things because they'll only forgive you for that emergency period up to a certain point, and they will expect you to hold to their standard at some point. So I don't know that it was a clearly defined line on when they switched from you're in an emergency to you're not, but as soon as you possibly can start solidifying those agreements, I would. Anything that you did temporarily and informally in the beginning, seek to solidify it and formally document it.
Absolutely. Immediately. Always put it in writing.
Okay, so let's talk insurance, which is another formally contracted partnership in the grand scheme of things. So I certainly am no expert on insurance, but these are the basic types of insurance that typically come into play in a post-disaster environment. Flood, wind, and other perils. There's often a named storm rider for hurricanes, and of course there's earthquake insurance and business interruption. I will tell you this, if you are in a flood zone, if you can at all afford it, get insurance. When FEMA comes into town and you've had a flood situation, you've got a building in a special flood hazard area, that is not insured, FEMA will reduce your grant by the amount that insurance would have covered. So up to $500,000 a building. So that's a big hit. It's always better to have insurance when you can. Public entities face budget crisis. There are certainly reasons to not have insurance coverage. However, just like with anything else, recognize your risk. If it's a flood risk is your biggest risk, work toward a plan to get them insured. Even if that plan is over a very long term, make your way toward getting there if possible. And again, budget issues always come into play, and that's typically the reason why buildings wouldn't be insured. But I'm sure Chad can attest, after the floods, they've had to as a condition of the grants, insure all of the buildings that were damaged. But I think that there was a consensus that they should anyway.
So we played Russian roulette with which facilities do we think might flood based on where they sit in our community. We won some, we lost some, and because our goal was to spend our money on education. Our dollars were trying to go toward education, not toward insurance. So prior to the flood, that's where we directed our resources, was towards education, and we spent as little as we could on flood, only those that were in a flood zone. And it was an annual thing that we did to try to, what I say, play Russian roulette with the flood policy. And post-flood, we have all campuses covered by flood now. And in hindsight, looking at it, we pay less than 1% of our overall budget toward that premium, but it protects all of our assets. I wish back then we would have had or felt that we had the ability to go ahead and get that coverage. Because one of the things you mentioned about the penalties involved with not having the flood coverage, it's just not worth it to not have the flood coverage. Because when you get into the process of FEMA looking at did you have it or not, and will they penalize you or not, there came into play that issue of how that law was written, how that rule's written around, is it by campus or by building. And for us in an old school system, each one campus had numerous buildings. And so on the first pass, the application of that rule was a $500,000 penalty per building. And we had to, do some serious talking to everybody involved to get that rule changed to one penalty of $500,000 per site. Because for us, although that campus evolved over years and was multiple buildings, it was one school site. And I think that we got support for the interpretation of that being that each campus was one penalty. And you don't want to be in those fights. Get your insurance and you won't even be there. So get flood insurance. Yeah.
So in this next section, we're going to talk about formally contracted partnerships.
All of these services that are listed here can be pre-positioned, that are activated if and when the need arises. The good thing about a pre-position contract is that there's no cost to the school system to pre-position it, other than the cost to formulate and publicly bid an RFP or RFQ. By pre-positioning, you'll know ahead of time what the unit cost will be when activated. You'll have the peace of mind that these services are already contracted to qualified firms, and it eliminates the time required to publicly bid in a post-disaster environment that's often chaotic. Talking order of operations, I would recommend procuring project management and grants management services first, and here's why. A grants management project management a consultant firm can formulate and or assist you in preparing an RFQ or RFP for all of the other contracts. They can help you with these planning exercises, the simulation events. They can look at policies, procurement, make sure they're all in line before you end up in a disaster.
Policies, FEMA policies is not something that educators and school system personnel know. As many disasters that we've been through, we don't know those policies. And we have numerous program management firms working for us, helping us with those kinds of things. After our flood event in 2016, we said, we need to go and prearrange these contracts for remediation and for grants management, program management. There's a lot of priorities after your disaster. And here we are 4 years later, and We're just getting to a point where we have 2 of those contracts in place, probably one more type contract like that we want to get in place. And since our flood, I've been caught again with one of those contracts not being in place. I just didn't get to it. You know, I would tell you, work as hard as you can at getting those prearranged contracts done. The remediator, for instance, we prearranged a remediation contract after the flood, and lo and behold, we had a fire in a classroom. And that person was able to show up that night and help us deal with that fire, and we had school 2 days later. 2 days later, missing just the classroom that caught fire. You know, and that was a testament to the fire department, but also to the remediator for showing up quick, minimizing the damage, containing it, and then cleaning it up so we could have school again 2 days later. Missed 1 day of school because we had that remediation contract in place.
And that was bid out in compliance with federal requirements.
Yes.
So if a disaster does strike, you know, they have the opportunity to use that contract for any remediation needs. It doesn't have to be a disaster, but if and when they do have the need after a disaster, it's already in compliance with FEMA requirements.
Right, and keep this in mind. If you're a school system, and we've been a small school system to large, we've been growing as long as I've been here. And so when I started, we were probably a small school system, and we're getting bigger now. We're probably medium sized now. But some of you may think, well, I can't afford that. Well, our school system can't afford to pay these consultants the fees that they charge. I would tell you that if you're following the rules and you procured everything properly, then these types of services are covered. They're potentially reimbursable is the terminology I learned. That if you follow the rules, then you're not going to have too much trouble when you apply for reimbursement of those same services. And this is just a service to help you plan the recovery. You know, you're going to hire a lot of other people to actually do the recovery, to build the buildings, to remediate. But don't be afraid of those costs. Know the rules, follow the rules, prearrange these contracts. We spend nothing, zero, on the prearranged contracts until we actually have a disaster and start asking them to do work. So we sat on the prearranged remediation contract for maybe a year without spending a dime, and then when we needed it, it was there.
So let's talk about each of the types of preposition contracts, specifically that are typical of post-federally declared disaster. So 1 and 2, debris removal and debris monitoring. These costs are not, this type of service is not always needed for schools. However, there may be instances in catastrophic events that require these services. You know, the school site might have a whole bunch of trees down, uprooted trees, debris on the school grounds that need to be either, pushed to the road for the county or parish to come pick up, or,
It's accessibility and safety. You're
Right,
trying to be able to
absolutely.
get through and access your facility and get those things out of the way to where it's safe enough that you can have school,
Right. So those, keep that in mind. That may be a need for the schools. Facility remediation. I would highly recommend that you pre-position a remediation contractor. There are always a lot of questions with FEMA when you don't properly procure a contract, even if it is an emergency need. So we found that by pre-positioning these remediation costs, like Chad has, he's got a contract now that's in place that has a unit cost for almost every type of work that the remediators could do. He knows what his costs are going to be. He simply has to apply a square footage to it. So, for the damaged
Generators,
area.
even the prearranged remediator for us knows our hazards. When there's a storm coming in, they call and check in, and we're able to talk to them about, okay, we might need generators at our coolers and freezers. They've prearranged that for us, and it's on call, it's on hold for us. So this recent storm, the double storm coming towards Louisiana, can't remember the names already. Laura and Marco, yeah, Marco and Laura came at us, and the remediator and us were on the phone, deciding, what do we need, what might we need, and when to pull the trigger on it. And it gave us a good comfort level that I was able to tell my superintendent, if we need to keep our food because we lost power, we can have generators, spot on. So.
Absolutely. And, by pre-positioning a remediator, they are in high demand after a catastrophic event. An entire region or, an entire state or part of a state they all need the same services in the same type of event, right? If you've got a pre-positioned contract, you are the priority of that
Yes.
vendor.
We learned that the hard way.
They might go after
Yes.
extra work, but you're the priority.
Mhm.
So, you know, just
The
like
companies
Chad
that rent
said,
the
they're
generators.
calling him ahead of time, making
Yeah.
sure that this public school system is in good hands. So, you know, that I highly recommend that. Temporary facilities aren't typically a pre-positioned contract, but it is something to think about. You know, it could be on a 3 to 5 year term, pre-positioned to stay at the same rate, you know, for that duration. We don't see a whole lot of the pre-positioning for modular temp facilities, but again, it is something to think about if maybe in a non-catastrophic event.
Yeah.
You know,
And-
not knowing the magnitude, but it's one thing to think about.
Yeah.
It could possibly be.
To add to that, thinking back to when we had to get temp facilities, one of the major decisions was, are you willing to accept used facilities or only new? And that's a big decision. You know, used facilities can be delivered a lot quicker than new facilities. If and they, you know, there's a cost issue with that, but it's a decision that you got to make. And maybe if you were to consider a prearranged temporary facilities contract, maybe you have options in there for both, so that depending on the disaster, depending on the site, you might have one site where you need it right away and you could go with used. You have to go with used because you can get it right away, as opposed to waiting for new to be produced. In our case, we were afraid of what we would get with used, and so we said we wanted all new. And you know, that brought us some challenges, but it also took more time. So those are things to consider, but definitely planning, failing to plan is planning to fail. You know, get into it, figure it out, and start writing up some prearranged things that are good for you, I would suggest.
So another good pre-position contract is to get a pool of architectural and engineering services. You know, they're procured based on qualifications and experience. You know, in the state of Louisiana, we have the state fee curve, so they all come in at the same rate. Most states do have the same type of rating system, rate system for architectural and engineering services. So, you know, you'll be making a decision based on qualifications, and you can pre-position, you know, multiple architects and select based on the magnitude of the event that you're dealing with. So, you know, you may want to select 5 pre-positioned architect firms, and you only need one. Pick the top one on the list and keep moving down as the magnitude grows.
And
you know,
it's important to note that your normal selection process that you do for an architect may or may not, depend on what state you're in, the bid law may or may not require you to have done anything besides pick one, you know. But if you're gonna seek federal reimbursement for that firm's fees, make sure that you have somebody guiding you on what are the proper protocols for choosing that architect. Architect selection, you may not be able to mirror what you did pre-disaster. You might have to follow some special federal rules, you know, the RFQ, RFP type procedures.
And anytime you pre-position any one of these types of contracts, always do it under federal procurement guidelines. You know, that's sort of the point in doing this is so that you can hold on to the funding that you paid out for these services.
And I think what I'm kind of thinking of, Sonny, is that professional services, in some cases, normally when there's no disaster, you know, school boards are able to pick who they want. They may even have a go-to firm that does all of their work and has for 50 years. You got to think about, if you want that reimbursement for that firm's services behind a disaster, do exactly what Sonny said. Be sure to follow the federal guidelines, or you may not get that reimbursement.
And then lastly, you know, pre-position a contract for project management, grants management, disaster recovery services. As I mentioned before, order of magnitude, I would suggest pre-positioning this one first. You know, they can, a project management, grants management firm can assist you in all of the other procurement aspects. You know, they can help you get processes in place and make sure that you're going to be compliant in an event.
Your PA at GOSEP, did I say that right? The person assigned to you at your local Office of Homeland Security can help you in the interim if you don't. But what we found is that some disasters are small enough that we can just stick with our GOSEP and use our, is it a PA? Is that what they call them?
Yeah, it's a liaison.
The liaison. But then at times you might find that that particular person is assigned to numerous school systems because the disaster was widespread. And that's where we at times have gotten to a point where, okay, I can't just use my PA at GOSEP to help me manage this and know what to do. That's when I reach out to program management, is when it gets to that point, where the PA can't by themselves help.
Right. And experience has demonstrated that the initial expenses incurred, contracts, and work performed are the most problematic for federal funding recipients, simply due to the complexities of federal policy and the lack of understanding of the policies. An experienced firm that does disaster recovery, PMGM, will help you avoid all of these pitfalls. And like I said, help you in the planning process for that matter.
So a properly procured, pre-positioned disaster recovery, project management, grants management consultant can help sub-grantees navigate the complexities of the federal grant program and really unlock the potential for economic, community, and infrastructure development from the beginning.
So, in summary, continuity of operations requires planning. You need to look at the physical options available to you, the funding options available to you, and most importantly, strengthen your formal and informal partnerships now. That means your own staff, the state and federal partners, informal relationships, local
law enforcement and
absolutely.
fire, EMS.
Your local OEP. There are several ways to plan and prepare for disaster operations, and we hope that we helped you a little bit today in preparing for that. In disasters, you can't recover alone, especially in larger events. So build those formal and informal partnerships in advance to lessen the challenges of your disaster recovery.
There are other important partners that we didn't have time to cover today, such as volunteers or private nonprofits. But if you want to discuss those or anything else related to disaster recovery or planning for continuity of operations, our contact information is here. Thank you for your time.